My mother wore black to my wedding. Not navy. Not a deep gray you could mistake for something else in bad lighting. Black. The exact same black she wore to my grandfather's funeral. The same black she wore the week our old dog died in the courtyard, curled up under the guava tree like he was only sleeping. And she wore it to the one day I had waited for my entire life. I didn't understand it then. I smiled through it. I told myself, maybe she just likes this dress. Maybe it's nothing. Don't ruin today over a dress. That's the thing about betrayal. It never announces itself with thunder. It walks in quietly, dressed like something else entirely, and by the time you recognize its face, it has already pulled out a chair, sat down at your table, and started eating from your plate as if it was always invited. My name is Rabia. I was 28 years old on the day I got married, and I believed, the way only a bride can believe, that this day would be the beginning of my happiness. I did not know it would be the beginning of a war I never asked to fight, a war against the very people who were supposed to be in my corner for life. Let me take you back a little further than the wedding day, so you understand who I was before any of this happened, because a person only makes sense once you know what shaped her. I grew up in a small house at the edge of the city, the kind of house with a tin roof that sang when it rained hard and a narrow courtyard where my mother dried red chilies every summer, turning the air a deep, dusty orange. My father drove a delivery van for a fabric wholesaler, leaving before sunrise and coming home smelling of diesel and cotton dust. My mother stitched clothes for the neighborhood women to bring in a little extra money, her sewing machine humming late into the night like a second heartbeat in our home. We didn't have much. But I never felt poor, because I had something many children don't. I had a dream, and I had two hands willing to work themselves raw for it. I have one sister. Her name is Sana. She is 3 years younger than me, and growing up, everyone said we looked like twins, though we were nothing alike underneath. She was the funny one, the charming one, the one who could walk into a room of strangers and leave with 3 new friends and a plate of extra sweets pressed into her hands by someone's grandmother. I was the quiet one, the one who studied at the kitchen table until midnight while everyone else in the house slept, the one whose report cards were praised and then set aside without much ceremony. Because good grades were expected of me the way breathing is expected of a person. No one throws a party because you remembered to breathe. I am not telling you this so you feel sorry for me. I am telling you this because it matters later. Because everything that happened to me on my wedding day, and in the months after it, happened for reasons my family had quietly decided long before I ever understood the shape of them. When I was 18, I told my parents I wanted to study computer science. My father laughed, not cruelly, just surprised, the way you laugh when a child says something wonderfully impossible. Girls in this family get married, he said, not looking up from the newspaper. They don't sit in front of computers all day. But I begged. I promised him it would not change anything about who I was to this family, that I only wanted a chance to build something with my own hands before someone else decided the shape of my life for me. My mother, surprisingly, was the one who tipped the scale. Let her try, she said. If she fails, she'll come back, and we'll find her a good match before she's 22. I did not fail. I worked 2 jobs through university, tutoring neighborhood children in the evenings, doing data entry for a small firm on weekends, sleeping less than I should have and drinking more tea than was probably healthy for a teenager. By the time I graduated, I had a job offer from a software company downtown, and for the first time in my life, I had money that was entirely mine. My name on a paycheck. A future finally beginning to take shape in my own 2 hands, instead of waiting to be handed to me by someone else's decision. And here is the part one need you to hold on to tightly, because it becomes the center of everything that follows, the root beneath every branch of what came later. 3.5 years ago, my father fell sick. Very sick, the kind of sick that turns a hospital corridor into the only world that exists, where you measure time not in days, but in test results and doctors' faces. It started as fatigue he brushed off as old age, then became chest pain he refused to mention until my mother found him gripping the kitchen counter one morning, unable to stand straight. The diagnosis, when it finally came, was heart disease serious enough to require surgery within weeks, not months. I did not think twice. I drained almost everything I had saved, nearly 4 years of working 2 jobs, skipping vacations, wearing the same 3 good outfits on rotation to save money, and I paid for his treatment. Not because I wanted anything in return. Because he was my father, and I loved him, and that is simply what daughters do when the people who raised them are drowning. When he recovered, slowly, over months of physiotherapy and quiet mornings on the porch relearning how to walk without getting breathless, there was a small plot of land the family owned on the outskirts of the city, nothing extraordinary. A patch of dirt with a half-built boundary wall no one had touched in a decade. With the little savings I had left after the hospital bills, and a loan I took out entirely in my own name, because no one else in the family had the salary slips a bank would accept, I built a house on it. A small house, but mine. I registered it under my name because I was the one signing the loan documents, the one whose salary the bank was trusting, the one who would be making payments alone for the next 12 years if that's what it took. My parents moved in with me once the house was finished. My sister visited on weekends, always cheerful, always bringing sweets from wherever she'd last been. For a while, almost 2 years, it felt like we were a family that had survived something hard together and come out the other side stronger for it. I would come home from work to the smell of my mother's cooking, sit on the small veranda with my father in the evenings while he told me stories about his own father, and I believed, foolishly and completely, that we had built something that could not be shaken. I did not know that inside that house, something else was growing quietly beside the love. Something that watched me pay every installment on time, watched me repaint the walls a soft cream color I'd saved up for separately, watched me plant a small guava tree in the courtyard the same week the loan officer approved my final disbursement, and felt, underneath the smiles and the shared meals, not gratitude, but a slow, simmering resentment that I was too trusting to notice. I met Bilal 2 years ago at a friend's engagement party, of all the ordinary places for a life to change. He was an architect, soft-spoken in a way that made you lean in rather than talk over him, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke and remembered small details you mentioned only once, the name of a childhood pet, the exact way you took your tea. We fell in love slowly, the way you fall asleep without noticing the exact moment it happens. You only notice, much later, that it already has. When he proposed, on a rooftop overlooking the old city with string lights, he'd spent an embarrassing amount of time arranging himself. My parents seemed happy. My mother cried, the way mothers are expected to cry at these moments. My sister hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe, laughing into my shoulder, telling me I'd found the good one. I believed, foolishly, that this happiness was simple, that it belonged only to me, uncomplicated, and that no one in my life would try to take a piece of it for themselves. But what I didn't know that day, standing on that rooftop with string lights reflected in Bilal's eyes, was that happiness, in some families, is never allowed to be simple. It is currency. It is counted, weighed, compared against what everyone else has or doesn't have. And somewhere in my family's quiet calculations, someone had already begun counting exactly what mine was worth. The wedding date was set for a warm evening in early spring, the kind of evening where the heat of the day softens into something gentle by sunset. I chose a soft gold dress, the color of turmeric and late afternoon light, because my grandmother once told me, when I was small enough to sit on her lap, that gold brings blessings to a bride and keeps evil eyes at a respectful distance. I spent months planning every small detail, the flowers, the songs the DJ would play as I walked in, even the exact shade of henna I wanted painted across my hands, deep and rust-colored. The way I'd always imagined it since I was a girl sketching wedding dresses in the margins of my school notebooks. It wasn't about extravagance. It was about finally having one day, out of all the days I had spent giving myself to other people's needs, that belonged entirely and unapologetically to me. The morning of my wedding, I sat in front of the mirror while my cousins fixed my jewelry, laughing about nothing and everything, the particular kind of laughter that only exists in a room full of women getting a bride ready. I felt lighter than I had felt in years, lighter than I think I had ever felt in my entire life. I remember catching my own eyes in the mirror and thinking, quite clearly, this is the happiest I have ever been. Nothing can touch this. And then my mother walked into the room. She was wearing black. A plain black outfit, no embroidery catching the light, no color anywhere on her, nothing that belonged within 100 feet of a wedding. My hands went still on the dressing table, my bangles falling silent mid-motion. My cousin beside me stopped laughing mid-sentence, her mouth still open on an unfinished joke. For a moment, the whole room seemed to hold its breath collectively, the way a room does right before something breaks. "Amy," I said carefully, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be, you didn't wear the yellow dress we picked together? We chose it in March, remember, at the tailor's." She looked at me, not with anger, not even with the sadness I might have understood and forgiven instantly, with something colder. Something that felt, even then, like a decision already made, sealed, and simply waiting for the right hour to be delivered. "I have something to discuss with you," she said, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from her sleeve. "After the ceremony." I told myself it was nothing. Brides tell themselves that a lot, I think, on the one day they most need everything to be exactly as beautiful as they imagined it. It's nothing. It's just today. Don't let anything ruin today. But some part of me, the part that had spent 28 years learning to read the silences in my family better than I ever learned to read their words, already knew, in the pit of my stomach, that something was coming. And it was going to be worse than a black dress. The wedding hall was full of warm golden light and the heavy sweetness of jasmine strung along every pillar. Music played, my friends danced in loose, joyful circles, and my father walked me down the aisle with tears standing in his eyes that, at the time, I mistook entirely for joy. I stood beside Bilal as we exchanged our vows in front of 200 people, his hand steady around mine, and for those few hours, I let myself believe completely that the black dress had been nothing more than a strange, forgivable coincidence, a mother's odd fashion choice on a long, emotional day. Until everything changed. It was near midnight, after most of the guests had drifted home and the hall had begun to empty into a scatter of chairs and half-eaten plates, when my mother pulled me into a quiet side room usually used for storing extra chairs. My father followed a step behind her, his hands clasped in front of him like a man walking into a meeting he didn't want to attend. My sister stood in the doorway, arms crossed loosely over her chest, wearing an expression I had never once seen on her face before, not celebration, not joy for me, but something sharp and expectant, like she already knew exactly what was about to be said and had simply been waiting, patiently, all night for the right moment. "Rabia," my mother began, her voice flat and strangely rehearsed, as though she had practiced this exact speech in front of a mirror the same way I had practiced my vows. "Now that you are married, you don't need the house anymore. You'll live with Bilal's family in Bilal's home. Sanaa is getting married next year, God willing. She needs a place of her own to start her life. We want you to sign the house over to her." I laughed. I actually laughed, a short, disbelieving sound, because for one absurd second, standing there in my wedding gold with henna still fresh on my hands, I genuinely thought it was some kind of joke. A strange, poorly timed wedding night joke that everyone would laugh about years from now. No one laughed with me. "That house is in my name," I said slowly, the smile draining off my face. "I paid for it. Every rupee of the down payment, every installment since. You know that better than anyone." My mother's expression didn't soften even slightly. "You paid for it while living under our roof, eating food I cooked every single day, using this family's name and connections to get that loan approved with less trouble than you'd have had alone. This family gave you everything you needed to build that house, Rabia. It's only fair that it goes to the daughter who still needs it." I looked at my father, waiting the way I had waited my whole childhood for him to step in and defend me, the way he always had when I was small and some neighbor's child had wronged me in the street. He looked at the floor instead, at a spot just past his own shoes, and said nothing. "Your mother is right," he finally said, so quietly I almost missed it under the music still drifting faintly from the main hall. "You have Bilal now. You have a new family, a new home waiting for you. Sanaa has nothing yet." I felt something crack open in my chest, not loudly, not violently, nothing that anyone standing outside that small room could have heard. It cracked the way a foundation cracks, silently, deep beneath the surface, long before the walls above it ever begin to visibly fall. I paid off your hospital bills, I said, my voice starting to shake despite every effort to keep it steady. I gave up 4 years of savings so you could live, Baba. I built that house with my own 2 hands, with a loan I am still paying off alone, every single month, without a single rupee of help from anyone in this room. And on my wedding day, you are asking me to sign it over to Sana. My sister finally spoke, uncrossing her arms. Don't make it sound so ugly, Rabia. You'll have a whole new house with your husband's family now. I have nothing of my own. Is it really so wrong that I want what you already have? It's wrong, I said, my voice breaking slightly on the word, because what I have, I earned. You didn't come to me and ask for help building something of your own. You waited until the one day I couldn't easily say no in front of 200 guests, and you asked me to erase myself from my own life instead. My mother's voice hardened, any pretense of gentleness gone from it now. We wore black today because we are mourning the daughter we raised, the one who used to listen to her family, who used to understand duty before herself. If you refuse us, you are choosing a stranger over your own blood. A stranger. That is what she called Bilal, the man who had stood beside me faithfully for 2 years, who had never once asked me for anything I couldn't freely give, who had married me knowing full well I still carried debts of my own from that very house. A stranger. And somehow, in that same breath, the sister who was demanding my home out from under me was called blood, as though blood alone earned a person anything they wanted, regardless of what it cost the person giving it. I walked out of that small room still in my wedding dress, gold fabric catching the hallway light in soft ripples, feeling for the first time in my entire life like a guest in my own family, polite, tolerated, useful right up until the moment I wasn't. Bilal found me sitting alone on a folding chair in the emptying hallway a few minutes later, my dupatta slipping off one shoulder, my hands still and cold in my lap. He didn't ask what was wrong immediately. He simply sat beside me, took my hand in both of his, and waited, the way he always did, giving me the room to arrive at my own words in my own time. When I finally told him everything, the black dress, the demand, the house, the word stranger, I expected him to be furious on my behalf. Instead, he was calm in a way that steadied something trembling inside me. Whatever you decide, he said, his voice low and even, I will stand behind you completely. But Rabia, that house is yours. Not because of a piece of paper with your name on it, though that matters too. Because of everything you sacrificed, alone, to build it while everyone else simply lived inside it. Don't let guilt talk you into signing away 4 years of your life in a single night, especially not tonight. I wanted to believe him completely, and some part of me did. But guilt is a strange, persistent thing. It doesn't care about facts laid out neatly like receipts on a table. It doesn't care that you were right, that the math was entirely in your favor. It only cares about the small, familiar voice in your head whispering, late at night when you're finally alone, but they're your parents. But she's your baby sister. What kind of daughter refuses her own family on the day she becomes a wife? For the next several weeks, that voice grew louder instead of quieter, feeding on every silence, every unanswered question I let myself sit with too long. My mother called almost every single day, not to ask how my new marriage was settling, not to ask whether I was happy in the new rhythm of my life, but only ever to ask if I had thought it over yet, her tone somewhere between patient and pointed, like a debt collector who still believed in family loyalty as leverage. My father sent short, careful messages that landed like small stones. Think about your sister's future. You were always the sensible one. My sister posted photographs online of houses she liked in our neighborhood, 3-bedroom, good sunlight, close to the market, tagging me underneath each one, as though I were already expected to be shopping for her new home with my own signature. I stopped answering their calls for a stretch of nearly 2 weeks, not out of anger exactly, but because every single conversation left me feeling hollowed out, scraped clean on the inside. I would hang up the phone and sit in silence on the edge of my new bed in Bilal's family home, staring at nothing in particular, wondering how a family could love you so visibly and so conditionally at the same time. How love could seem to disappear entirely the moment you stopped being useful in the exact shape they required. During that stretch of silence, Bilal's family surprised me in ways I hadn't expected. His mother, a soft-spoken retired schoolteacher named Farida, noticed almost immediately that something was wrong, the way mothers who have taught for 30 years learn to notice things in the set of a young woman's shoulders. She didn't push. She simply began inviting me to sit with her in the evenings while she watered her small collection of potted plants on the balcony, talking about nothing important: the neighbor's noisy rooster, a recipe she wanted to try, an old film she'd loved as a girl. It took almost a week before I finally told her a version of what had happened at the wedding. She listened without interrupting once, and when I finished, she simply said, "A house you built with your own hands is not a favor you owe anyone, Beta. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise, in this house or that one." Her husband, Bilal's father, was quieter still, but one evening he sat across from me at dinner and said, almost offhandedly, between bites, "In this family, we don't ask our daughters-in-law to give up what belongs to them. We only ask that they feel safe enough to keep it." It wasn't a grand speech, but it landed somewhere deep, because it was the first time in weeks that anyone had spoken to me about my own house without treating it as a bargaining chip. I confided fully in my closest friend, Nadia, over tea one evening, in the small cafe near my old office where we used to meet during lunch breaks before everything changed. I remember telling her, through tears I hadn't expected to fall in public, "I don't understand, Nadia. I gave them everything I had. Why does it still feel like it wasn't enough? Why do I feel guilty for keeping something that was already mine?" Nadia held my hand across the small table and said something I have never forgotten since. "Rabia, some families don't love you for who you are. They love you for what you provide. The moment you stop providing, or the moment someone else needs what you have more urgently, in their eyes, you become expendable. That is not your failure. That is theirs, and you shouldn't carry it as if it's yours to fix alone." I didn't want to believe her, not fully, not that evening. I wanted so badly to believe my parents loved me the way parents are supposed to love their children, without conditions, without a running ledger, without quietly keeping score of who has given more and who still owes what. But the longer I sat with the discomfort of the truth, turning it over and over the way you turn a stone in your palm, the more I began to notice a pattern I had spent my entire life politely refusing to see. I remembered every birthday where Sanaa's celebration was louder, bigger, more photographed, because she was more social and made friends easily, as though my quieter joy required less acknowledgement. I remembered every family disagreement where I was gently but firmly told to compromise first, simply because I was the responsible one, as though responsibility was a punishment dressed up as a compliment. I remembered every sacrifice I had made quietly over the years, skipping a friend's trip to help with home expenses, giving up a scholarship interview because it clashed with Sanaa's school function, handing over my first salary bonus toward household repairs without being asked twice. Sacrifices that were simply expected, absorbed into the family's daily functioning without comment, never once celebrated, never once repaid. While every small thing Sanaa gave, even something as minor as helping fold laundry once a week, was treated in comparison like a small miracle worth announcing to relatives on the phone. I had spent my whole life being the daughter who gave, and Sanaa had spent her whole life, quite comfortably, being the daughter who received. And somehow my parents had convinced themselves, and had nearly convinced me too, that this arrangement was simply fair, because I was strong enough to carry the weight of it without complaint, and strength, in our family, had somehow become confused with limitless obligation. But strength is not the same thing as endless capacity. Even the sturdiest bridge ever built will eventually collapse if you keep adding weight to it year after year and never once reinforce what's underneath. One night, about 5 weeks after the wedding, my mother came to Bilal's family home uninvited, arriving just after dinner while I was still clearing the table. She sat across from me in the small living room, refusing the tea Farida offered her, and for the first time in this entire ordeal, she dropped the pretense of duty entirely and spoke to me in plain, unguarded terms. "If you don't sign the house over to your sister," she said, her voice low so it wouldn't carry to the kitchen, We will tell everyone in the family that you abandoned your own parents the moment you got married. That you turned your back on your sister out of jealousy because she is getting married soon too, and you couldn't stand watching her be happy in a home of her own. Do you understand what that story will do to your name, Rabia? To Bilal's family's name, once it spreads through every relative we both share. There it was, finally, laid bare on the table between us like a card no longer worth hiding. Not a request anymore, dressed politely in the language of duty and family. A threat delivered plainly, by the very same woman who had raised me from infancy, fed me from her own hands during illness, held mine tightly when I was a child crossing a busy street for the first time on my own. I sat there in Farida's quiet living room, feeling the last small piece of denial inside me shatter completely, and finally. They had never truly planned to ask me, I understood then, all at once, with a clarity that felt almost physical. They had planned, from the very beginning, to corner me. The black dress at my wedding hadn't been a coincidence, and it hadn't been some private symbol of a mother mourning her daughter's natural drift into married life. It had been the opening move in a plan they had already agreed upon, quietly, long before I ever walked down that aisle in gold. That night, after my mother left without finishing her sentence properly, without even a proper goodbye, I did not cry the way I had cried before, engulfing exhausted sobs into Bilal's shoulder. Something inside me had shifted instead, quietly and completely, the way weather shifts overnight without any warning storm to announce it. The pain was still there, sharp and constant beneath my ribs, but underneath it, something new had begun to grow. Not hatred, exactly. Not the desire to hurt anyone the way I had been hurt. Something quieter, steadier, and far more dangerous to people who have spent their whole lives assuming you will never, ever change. Clarity. I finally understood, sitting there long after midnight while Bilal slept beside me, unaware I was still awake, that being kind to people who only respect you when you are useful is not virtue at all. It is a slow, patient form of self-erasure, dressed up in the comfortable language of duty and daughterhood. And I was done erasing myself, piece by piece, year after year, simply to preserve a peace that had never once been real to begin with. I looked at Bilal the next morning, over breakfast, and said the words that would quietly change everything that came after. I'm not signing anything, I said. And I'm not staying silent about any of this, either. Not anymore. Revenge, I have come to learn since that morning, does not always look like the movies make it look. There are no shouting matches staged for effect, no dramatic confrontations performed in front of a gathered crowd, no doors slammed hard enough to rattle the windows. Sometimes revenge looks like something far quieter and, in its own way, far more devastating, simply telling the truth, clearly and completely and without apology, in a world that has spent years quietly counting on your silence to keep functioning smoothly. I started with the facts, laid out methodically the way I would approach any problem at work. I gathered every receipt from my father's hospital treatment, 3.5 years of payments made directly from my own bank account, dated and itemized. I gathered the complete loan documents for the house, every installment paid precisely on time, every signature on every page mine and mine alone, no cosigner, no shared liability. I gathered screenshots of the messages from my mother and sister, the ones demanding the house outright, the one from my mother threatening my reputation if I refused to comply. Sent in black and white text that could not later be denied or softened into misunderstanding. Then, 3 weeks after that quiet morning breakfast conversation with Bilal, I called a family meeting myself on my own terms, for the first time in my life. Not the kind of meeting where I arrived already prepared to beg to be heard, the way I had shown up to every family conversation before this one. The kind where I already knew, with complete certainty, exactly what I was going to say, and in what order, and I had no intention of leaving that room until every word had been spoken. My parents arrived expecting, I think, another conversation they could slowly pressure me into losing, the way they had worn me down on smaller things for years, where to spend a holiday, which relative's opinion mattered more, whose comfort came first in any given room. My sister arrived dressed almost celebratory, ironically enough, as though she had come to formalize a victory she still assumed was already hers, a signature away from being finalized. I sat across from all three of them at the small wooden dining table in my own house, the very house they wanted, the house I had built with borrowed money and unborrowed will, the house I was never, under any circumstance, going to let go of simply to ease my own guilt. "I want to say something," I began, my voice steadier than I expected it to be, and I only intend to say it once. "I'd like all three of you to actually listen, rather than wait for your turn to speak." I laid the hospital receipts on the table first, spreading them out slightly so the dates were visible. I paid for Baba's treatment with nearly 4 years of my savings. No one in this room asked me to do that. I did it because I love him, and because that is what you do for people you love when they are frightened and sick. I have never once, in 3.5 years, brought this up to guilt anyone in this family. Until today. My mother shifted uncomfortably in her chair, glancing briefly at my father, who wouldn't meet my eyes at all, his gaze fixed somewhere on the middle of the table. "I built this house with a loan taken entirely in my own name," I continued, laying the loan documents down one by one, methodically, the way you might deal cards. "Every single payment, every month alone, out of my own salary. Not once did any of you offer to contribute even a single installment. Not once did anyone ask if the burden was heavy. It simply wasn't your burden to notice." Sanaa crossed her arms tightly across her chest, her earlier confidence starting to falter at the edges. "So now you're keeping score, Rabia? Is that what this is?" "No," I said, my voice remaining steady in a way that genuinely surprised even me, given how much my hands had trembled the night of the wedding. "You kept score first, Sanaa. All of you did, long before I ever raised the subject. You decided, the moment I got married, that my years of sacrifice had a quiet expiration date, and that your needs automatically outranked mine simply because you asked louder and later, and with more confidence that I would eventually fold. You wore black to my wedding, Amy, not out of mourning, as you claimed, but as a warning, a way to make me feel small and unsettled on the one single day of my life that was supposed to belong entirely to me. And when a warning wasn't quite enough on its own, you followed it up with an outright threat to destroy my name within this family. We are your parents," my father said quietly, finally looking up, his voice carrying an old, familiar authority that had worked on me for 28 years, but no longer landed the same way. "You don't get to speak to us this way, Rabia." "I am speaking to you the way I should have spoken years ago," I said, and I meant it completely. "I am not refusing you out of anger, though I have every right to feel angry after everything. I am refusing you because what you asked of me was not fair, by any honest measure, and no amount of inherited guilt is going to convince me otherwise anymore. That chapter of my life is finished." My mother's composure, so carefully maintained since she walked in, finally cracked down the middle. "So you're choosing that man's family over your own blood then? Is that truly what you want people to say about you?" "I'm choosing myself," I said simply, and something in the room seemed to still completely at those 3 words. For the first time in my entire life, I am choosing myself, without apologizing for it afterward. And if that means this family only ever wanted me around for what I could provide, then I am done pretending that arrangement was ever love to begin with. I did not scream at any point. I did not cry, though the pressure of unshed tears sat heavy behind my eyes the entire time. I simply stood up from the table when I had said everything I needed to say, and for the first time in my adult life, I let the silence that followed belong to me, instead of rushing to fill it the way I always had before, with apologies, with premature compromises, with the exhausting, invisible labor of making everyone else comfortable at my own continual expense. What happened in the weeks that followed surprised even me, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Word travels quickly through families, and faster still when there are receipts and screenshots to prove decisively who has been telling the truth all along. Within a month, relatives who had already heard my mother's version of events, that I had cruelly abandoned my family out of petty jealousy the moment I married, slowly began hearing the real one instead, passed along in low voices at gatherings, over the phone between aunts, in the particular way that truth eventually finds its way out even when someone has worked hard to bury it. The hospital bills. The years of loan payments. The black dress at the wedding. The threat delivered in Farida's quiet living room. My mother's own sister, my Aunt Yasmin, was the first to speak up openly at a family gathering a few weeks later, in front of at least a dozen relatives who had gathered for a cousin's small birthday celebration. Rabia carried this family on her back for years, quietly, without ever once asking for recognition, she said, setting down her teacup with a decisive click against the saucer. And you repaid 4 years of sacrifice by trying to shame her into giving up everything she built, on her own wedding day of all occasions. I did not raise my own children to treat family the way you treated her, and I won't sit here and pretend I didn't hear about it. Slowly, over the following months, the narrative my parents had tried so carefully to control began slipping entirely out of their hands, one relative's changed opinion at a time. Not because I sought revenge through gossip or deliberate cruelty. I never once repeated the story myself beyond that single family meeting, but because the truth, once it has finally been spoken clearly and with evidence behind it, is remarkably difficult to bury back down again. My father was the first of the 3 to come to me, months later, alone, without my mother, without Sana trailing behind him for support. He arrived on a quiet Sunday afternoon and sat across from me at the same small table where I had laid out my evidence, the way he used to sit with me when I was a little girl bringing home a report card. Before pride and pressure and my mother's insistence had slowly reshaped him into someone I barely recognized on the night of my wedding. I was wrong, he said simply, turning his teacup slowly in his hands without drinking from it. I let your mother push me into demanding something that was never truly ours to ask for in the first place. I watched you build that house with your own 2 hands, installment by installment, and I still let myself pretend it was somehow owed to your sister instead. I'm sorry, Rabia. I'm sorry I let you feel like a stranger in your own family, on the one day you least deserved to feel that way. I didn't forgive him instantly, sitting there across the table from him. Forgiveness, I have come to understand slowly since that afternoon, is not a switch you flip simply because someone finally says the right words in the right order. It is a process, careful and unhurried, built the same patient way trust itself is built, one honest moment stacked carefully on top of the last. But I let him back into my life cautiously, the way you let sunlight back gradually into a room that has been kept dark for a very long time, testing the brightness before opening the curtains all the way. My mother took considerably longer to arrive at the same place. Pride, I have learned, is a heavy thing to finally set down, especially for a woman who has spent her whole life believing that keeping her family firmly in line was simply the same thing as keeping them safe from a harsher world outside. But even she, eventually, nearly 8 months after the wedding, admitted quietly, without any audience present, without the performance of black dresses and carefully rehearsed speeches this time, that she had let her fear for Sana's uncertain future curdle into something that ultimately hurt the daughter who had never once, in 28 years, let her down. Sana and I are still rebuilding, slowly, in careful and uneven pieces. She apologized eventually, in her own halting way, over coffee one afternoon nearly a year after the wedding, though I don't believe she has fully grasped yet just how deeply that particular night wounded something in me that hasn't fully healed even now. Some relationships mend slowly, unevenly, in fits and starts rather than one clean turning point, and I have made a kind of peace with that uneven pace. I no longer expect perfect, cinematic endings tied up neatly with a bow. I only expect honesty going forward, and I only extend my full trust now to those who are willing to patiently earn it back, one small proof at a time. As for the house, it is still mine, exactly as it always legally was. I still live there with Bilal, and some quiet mornings, when the early light comes slanting through the small courtyard and touches the leaves of the guava tree I planted the very week my loan was finally approved, I think about how close I came, that terrible wedding night, to giving it all away simply because I was afraid of being called selfish for keeping what was rightfully, undeniably mine. If there is one thing I want you to carry away from my story, let it be this: love that only shows up reliably when you are useful is not love at all. It is a transaction quietly disguised as devotion, and it will bankrupt you slowly if you let it continue unchecked for long enough. You are allowed to give generously to the people you love. I will always believe deeply in that, and I still give freely to those who have earned it, but you are never, under any circumstance, obligated to keep giving until there is nothing left standing of yourself. My mother wore black to my wedding because, in her own mind at the time, she was quietly mourning the version of me that would always, reliably, say yes. The version of me that would keep shrinking herself year after year to make comfortable room for everyone else's needs and wants. That particular version of me did die that night, it's true. But what slowly grew in her place, over the difficult months that followed, was someone stronger, someone who finally understood, all the way down, that being a good daughter, a good sister, a genuinely good person, does not require disappearing quietly every single time someone else decides your life is worth less than their own. I kept my house. But far more importantly than that, in the end, I kept myself. And of everything I could have won that year, that was the only thing that ever truly mattered.